this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In this episode of the World War II podcast, we're going to be looking at the Essex Yeomanry and their role in the Second World War. With a history stretching back to the late 18th century, the regiment had seen action in the First World War, but in World War II they found themselves in the thick of the fighting once again. From the Western Desert and the Italian campaign to the beaches of Normandy and the advance into Germany, the Essex Yeomanry played a part in some of the war's most crucial battles. I'm Angus Wallace, and today my guest is Stephen Keoghane, author of Shield and Protect, an illustrated history of the Essex Yeomanry. Drawing on extensive archival research and first-hand accounts, his book explores the regiment's experiences and the challenges they faced as they transitioned from their cavalry roots to modern mechanised warfare. Stephen joined the Royal Wessex Yeomanry in 1994 and served as the regimental medical officer for 22 years in the Royal Gloucestershire Hussar and Royal Wiltshire Yeomanry squadrons. Welcome, Stephen. So, in the wide sweep of the war, individual county regiments in Britain, I tend to think, get overlooked in the discussion of army groups and divisions. But the British Army is made up of regiments, and these were traditionally drawn from specific localities, which can make them distinctively regional. So when were the Essex Yeomanry first formed?
They were formed in the late 1700s as a response to the threat of invasion from France. They were formed along county lines. They were officered by the landowners, aristocrats of the county, and they were cavalry. And many of them fought in the South African War. The Essex Yeomanry didn't. And then there was an order of precedence. So depending on when you were formed and disbanded or not. So many of them came and went, and the Essex Yeomanry did. So the Essex Yeomanry went down the batting order because they'd been disbanded a couple of times.
So presumably they survived the Haldane reforms, and that sort of bumps them up in the early 1900s. Yeah,
they did. But if you've been disbanded once, it sort of takes you down the snakes and ladders and you don't really come back up fully. So those who kept even a troop, they at the top.
Do they become a TA unit then?
Yeah, they do. They become a territorial unit, yeah.
Am I right in saying the Yeomanry is sort of a militia? I'm never quite sure of how they sort of figure out militia, yeomanry. It suddenly makes sense when you go, it's the territorial army in the Haldane reforms.
It became a part of the territorial army. Before that, how would you class it? It was the yeomanry were in existence themselves. It was separate to everything else, and still was a bit even when I was serving. So they survived the various reforms. First World War served as cavalry. They served everywhere really except the Somme, both as dismounted and mounted cavalry. Fraserburgh Ridge and Monchy-le-Preux Arras were their big battle honours. Then they were disbanded again, and then reformed again under the territorial force in 1920. And then the yeomanry as a whole then were given options, and they were given the option of lose your horses and become artillery, or mechanise. A few kept their horses. So one of the squadrons of my old regiment, the Royal Wiltshire Yeomanry, kept their horses. The Warwickshire Yeomanry kept their horses, as of course did the Scots Greys, a regular regiment. But the Essex Yeomanry chose to move to Royal Field Artillery. One of the reasons is they kept some horses, of course, for pulling the guns. They allowed the officers to keep their chargers.
Cling on to them.
Yeah, so they were still pulling guns with horses, but actually did then mechanise. They involved the use of tractors to pull guns in the late 1920s on a very bleak range. I was on holiday there last year up in Snowdonia. I can't remember the name of the range, but it really is in the middle of nowhere. So then we go into the sort of immediate pre-war era of sort of 38, 39. And the nomenclature gets difficult now because there ended up with 3 regiments of Essex Yeomanry, who bore the name of Essex Yeomanry. They were artillery, and we start with 104 Regiment, which was a horse artillery regiment, had 2 batteries, 2 troops of 4 guns, based out of Brentwood and Chelmsford. But then in 39, there was a need for more artillery. So a second regiment of Essex Yeomanry was formed, which is 147. And then later in 44, a third regiment, which is the Herts and Essex Yeomanry were formed, who had a short existence. They were on the beaches, I think D+3, and then were disbanded in about September 44 when artillery was needed. So there were 3 who carried the name.
So are they're not battalions of the Essex Yeomanry. They're individual regiments bearing the...
These were individual regiments. So now they've moved from cavalry to artillery. So they've lost their squadron identity. They are now batteries with troops of guns. But they still kept their sort of cavalry yeomanry traditions. The uniforms in sort of late 20s, early 30s were still wore spurs. Even in 38, 39, many of the officers mobilised wearing spurs. And there's a wonderful moment. I was reading this morning that winter of 39, they've been sent to London to guard key features at railway stations, viaducts, that sort of thing. They didn't really have anything to do with them. And they're wearing their cavalry uniforms with puttees and spurs, as are the officers. And a London district brigadier came along and just couldn't believe what he saw, that they looked like something from the First World War, where everyone else was wearing battle dress. So those cavalry traditions carried on.
Yeah, I suspect even at the time of the First World War, there was a certain class element to it, them being yeomanry and horses. And that must have given a certain sort of identity to it. Does that start to wear away as they mechanise?
No, I don't think that goes until the 1950s. Even, I think, I joined the Yeomanry as a whole in 1994, and I think even then it was a pretty smart setup. It like the rest of the army has changed a bit. So Essex didn't have many of the aristocrats that other counties had, that, for instance, Wiltshire had. When I read about the Wiltshire Yeomanry, you look at the officers' mess photograph of 39, and you've got the 3 richest men in England in there. Essex didn't have that, but it had a lot of wealthy landowners.
Well, I was probably that fox hunting set. It's a Diary of a Fox Hunting Man.
Yeah. So in the First World War, the 4 squadrons were when they were reformed were based around the local hunts, and some famous names like Strutt of Strutt and Parker estate agents and Parker, but they were both Essex yeomen. So yeah, the officers were still wealthy. They still hunted. The men came from very different backgrounds. That there were those who worked in offices, those who worked on the land. There were a lot of gentlemen rankers, farmers, who never wanted to be promoted. And again, even in my time, I recall the gentleman ranker who had no intention of ever getting commissioned. And then in 39, in came the militia. Now, I've always struggled with this concept of militia in 1939 because that's what the TA called them. But they were really mobilised enlisted men that had gone to a centralised training school, wherever it was. So about 120 came to 147 from, I think they were trained in Wrexham. And they couldn't believe what they saw when they arrived with this regiment. They were met by what they presumed were sort of village idiots wearing hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit. And then someone said, well, actually, those are your comrades. That's the rest of the regiment. There's a very famous guy called Stephen Dawson who died some years ago, but he recorded his memories in the Imperial War Museum, and he wrote a lot in the regimental journals. And he was originally, I think, a Londoner, and he'd served in the Royal Naval Reserve, the Royal Signals Reserve, and then moved to Essex. And he described them as peasants who couldn't read or write, some of these soldiers. And that was from, an enlisted man, but a Londoner. So Essex then was very different from Essex now. Essex was a very, very rural county, as rural really as anywhere else. And that came home to me. I was in the National Army Museum probably about 2 years ago and looking for some stuff. And the archivist said, you may want to listen to this, which is a recording of a First World War cavalryman from about 1960. And his accent was as far removed from Essex as you get. It was a very soft, almost Somerset West Country rolling accent. And that sort of typified the rural parts of Essex of the 20s and 1930s.
So the first units are posted, am I right in saying they're not posted to France, they're posted to the Middle East? Yeah,
so 104, which sort of had its horse artillery identity, then it had it removed, is mobilised and sent to the Middle East. They've still got their First World War guns when they go. That they had training guns, obviously, in the drill halls, which were labelled as not to be fired. And that's what they trained within sort of 38, 39. They went out to Palestine with similar guns, not the same training guns, and took those out into the desert in 40 and early 41. I think their 25 pounders came to them. I think it was in November 40. But up until that, they had fired these First World War 4.5 howitzers in the desert. And as with everybody else in Palestine, I think it's a really interesting period, that 39-40 in Palestine, because the whole of the cavalry division was out there, horsed. They didn't really have a role. Lady Astor very famously called them the Palestine Home Guard because they weren't doing a lot and seemed to be enjoying life. They acclimatized for about 6 weeks, often at a beach to get used to the sun. Every variety of sport known to man went on there, including horses. There was shooting. There's even at one point some skiing up in the cedars of Lebanon. So they had quite a nice time out there. And that went for the whole division, really, not just for 104. And then they gradually moved out into the desert in the sort of late 1940. And it came to real shocks.
That'll be after the Italians have sort of rolled over the Egyptian frontier and actually sort of the war heats up in the Middle East at that point, isn't it? So
Yes, and their sort of first experience of combat was being bombed. And there's some incredible descriptions of the bombs falling, and one that I followed through, which was a description of a gunner who'd been mortally wounded. And I had 3 separate accounts of him being put out of his misery by one of the sergeants with a single shot to the head. And they're very vivid descriptions of their first experience of bombs dropping on them.
So that's the end of, towards the end of 1940. They've got their 25 pounders November. They'll have got those issued just as they're taking part in Operation Compass, presumably O'Connor's offensive, which is what, December?
Yes, I remember talking about this, saying it's a bit like a sports game, isn't it? The sort of move the British Army has up and down the desert, and the ball goes one way and it goes the other way, and they drift up and down. So they push west, and then really everything starts getting interesting and they're involved in Bardia and attacks on Bardia and Solomon and things when they retreat the Benghazi handicap towards Tobruk.
But it's incredible that they're taking part in one of the most amazing operations of the early part of the war that we've all forgotten about.
Yeah. No, I find this part of the war really interesting because they're really green. I mean, most of these units that have gone out there have not done a lot of military training. They're all arms integration, wasn't really a thing, and it doesn't just go for the artillery; it goes for the armor as well. They just weren't experienced in it, but they performed well, supporting predominantly Australian infantry as they moved west, and then retreated. But of all you read a lot about the retreats towards Tobruk, the handicap, that it was utter chaos. Units just all over the place. They seemed to keep themselves disciplined during that move. And there are some fantastic descriptions of them moving the guns back and not wanting to lose any of the guns, obviously.
They're then holed up with the Australians in Tobruk, aren't they, for 200 and something days? Yeah,
they sit in Tobruk, until really Crusader pushes up towards Tobruk and the breakout from Tobruk. And they're there through the misery of Tobruk. Some of them are evacuated to Alexandria, and there's casualties. Lots of descriptions of the observation posts, which I wasn't really aware of, which are these, they describe as Punch and Judy tents, really a ladder stuck to poles to give a view of the desert with some form of canvas sacking on it to stop people being seen. So the observation, the Foos would sit up there and look out over the desert. And it wasn't a very healthy place to be when airburst was dropping above you. They had access to some of the Italian guns, bizarrely. They were using Italian anti-aircraft guns to try and lob shells because they could get them well outside the Tobruk perimeter. And also some, I think, 4.8 Italian heavy artillery pieces, which were really unreliable and had the shells. There were a lot of dud shells, and they were very, very dangerous. They had a tendency to attach a string to it and retire a long way before firing it.
Once relieved from Tobruk, they've taken, they were pushed into Tobruk. What condition do they come out of that siege in? Do they find themselves needing more, to be fully replaced? I'm slightly intrigued by, what I'm intrigued by is when a unit's been through such heavy fighting and essentially cut off, they must need their, a lot of men being replaced, at which point do you almost find themselves as a new unit? So many men being swapped in and out?
It started changing before that in 39 when the so-called militia, the nationally recruited gunners came in. So if you put 100 men in a regiment who are not from that county, that the nature of the regiment changes a bit. They did lose some. They lost some from illness, of course. They were involved in Ghazala. And then when they moved back into Egypt, and the preparation was then all looking towards 42 and Alamein, a battery was removed from them. So 414 battery, a third of the regiment was taken away to be sent somewhere else. And they didn't know where else it was going. They didn't know where else they were going until they got on the ship. They presumed it was Ceylon, but it, in fact, was Burma. So that was when it had to, the regiment had to be rebuilt in Egypt at that time. And more batteries were raised. And then they moved from Egypt, they were involved in Alamein, post-Alamein, up into Syria to train. I find that period in Syria really interesting because there were a lot of troops in Syria then. So post-Alamein, pre-Italy, training for who knows what. They were training up in the Syrian mountains around the Turkish border, theoretically against the threat from Germany, but Vichy French threat had gone by then, and smugglers. But really, it was training for the invasion of Italy. They were training in mountain warfare. They moved down to the coast and practiced amphibious landings on the coast. None of them knew it was the invasion of Italy, but in essence, it was mountain training for Italy. So that was 104 who spent their time in Syria before moving up into Italy. And then 414 battery were siphoned off to go to Burma.
This is what, 42?
42, yeah. So they were involved in...
So if they're in Burma at 42, it must be early 42 if they're thinking Burma, otherwise they'd be going straight to India.
Well, they're involved in a lot. So they get to Ceylon. It's only then that they're told where they're going. So even the battery commander opened his orders as he left Egypt and he wasn't told where he was going. They knew he had tropical uniform. And then they arrive in Rangoon. And they're arriving in Rangoon as it's being sacked, essentially. There are fires burning there, looting going on. The Japanese are nearby. And they suddenly realize this is very, very different from desert warfare. All their training for over the shooting in the desert is just gone. The batteries are split. 2 troops support, I think it's 3 RTR, and 2 troops support the 7th Hussars. And they are really the rear guard as the army retreats north towards India. And they're pushing forward, firefighting, unhitching their guns, firing, hitching up again, and moving on, supporting the tanks. And they're really busy. As you know, the roads were frequently blocked by the Japanese, and the artillery would be brought up to shell those roadblocks to allow the retreat to continue. And then sometimes they were sent back to reshell as troops hadn't come through. A busy time for them.
Presumably that must be incredibly difficult. You come from the desert where you can see for literally miles, and then you're in the jungle. All right, I know Burma's not all jungle. I know there's some open areas, but it's still, the terrain is incredibly difficult. With no training, they're sort of they're dropped into it and expected to develop a whole new way of warfare.
They were no longer firing over distance. The distances they were firing over were quite short now, sometimes over open sites. There's one famous incident when there is yet another roadblock, and the officer is ranging his guns by moonlight, trying to work out where this roadblock is. There was a young captain, I think he was a lieutenant, Mike Patterson, who'd already had a military cross from the desert, 7th Hussars, who'd been tied to the roadblock by the Japanese. He'd been flogged and he was just left there to die. And if you go to the Queen's Royal Hussars Museum in Warwick, a lot of his uniform, etc., is there. They were shelling that particular roadblock, not knowing he was there. But it was an Essex shell that actually saved his life, because the Essex shell severed his ropes, which allowed him to get out. And it was from an airburst in palm trees above. And he escaped and survived. So that sort of pattern repeated itself moving up.
They're using this 25 pounders, so they're big guns as well.
All 25 pounders. And they did well to keep the guns, even at the last retreat across the river. They managed to get the guns across. They had to leave a lot of the transport, but the artillery, the guns are sacred. The guns had to be saved. One point they became slightly feral, a bit like the troops in the desert, that they got into this lifestyle of living as mobile artillery in Burma a bit too early. And dispensed with uniform. There's a famous picture of one of the troop officers wearing a white linen suit, sitting on a deck chair on top of his honey tank. And the brigade commander wasn't very happy with this at all. And the battery commander, Major Pereira, was concerned that his troops become feral. And he gave them 2 days to sort out their kit, and then he's going to inspect them. And they'd been keeping pigs in the quads to eat, essentially, but alive. And they decided they had to get rid of these pigs before they were inspected. And they couldn't. I mean, and the description of the young subaltern trying to shoot the pig, which didn't work. And they tried to beat the pig over the head with a ram for putting shells down the gun, which still doesn't work. And eventually the pig dies. And they can't do this to the second pig. So they leave it in its box, an ammunition box. They're small piglets during the inspection. And they'd given these pigs ranks. I think they were both second lieutenants. The troops had given them names as well. And the battery commander comes to inspect, and he knows exactly what's going on, opens up the ammunition box to see a small piglet, and says, "Oh, it's a very unusual place to keep one of my lieutenants, isn't it? It'll be gone by the morning, I hope." So they managed to move away from being slightly feral and back to being proper soldiers again. But they moved across into India, and then the battery then was absorbed into the Royal Artillery proper, and that Essex name disappeared from that particular battery. It was 14 RHA. It was commanded by the battery commander. So that the Essex nature of 414 battery, who'd fought in the desert and fought in Burma, changed at that point.
Stephen, we're going to pause there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Meanwhile, back at home, am I right in saying is it the 147 is created?
Yeah.
Was that an existing TA unit, or did they create a new?
No, so there was one Essex Yeomanry regiment, and then in July 1939 there was a requirement for more artillery. So 147 was formed and given 2 batteries, one at Colchester, one at Harlow. Their first CO was a very experienced gunner who, and again we go back to the sort of class nature of the regiment, brought his stable boy, butler and batman with him, who served him throughout the war, and he'd be mentioned in dispatches in the First World War, the new commanding officer. So they were again locally recruited. They weren't as well established as 104 because they were new. So they didn't have the same troop identity, the same troop NCOs, troop officers. It was all very, very new. The men were all volunteers or had been moved across one of the other batteries. They started out in civilian clothes. So it was a bit more Dad's Army in a way until they were issued with kit. But they had plenty of time to play with because they didn't go anywhere until D-Day. Yeah, they spent the whole that time in the UK.
Presumably they're low down on the pecking order as the BAF come back from France. They'll get the pickings of the kit.
Yeah, although bizarrely, we'll come on to, sure, that at D-Day they're right at the front. They're the first guns on the beach. Again, the officers were local people who all seemed to know each other. Many of them were recruited from various equestrian events, too, notably on a race course. It was pretty crude. The men were sleeping on straw palliasses in concrete buildings. And then after mobilisation, a lot of them were sent home because they had nowhere to keep them. They couldn't let them all sleep in the drill hall. So they would send them home and they'd come back to work the next day somehow. They had no weapons. Pickhelves, one of the officers, raided his personal collection of antique firearms and dished out those to the men. So it took a while for them to go anywhere. And again, they were armed with 4.5 howitzers, marked drill purposes only. And they didn't have enough. They had a few to train with between them. So they spent their time around Essex and then started moving out and were eventually issued with priests. And then converted to sextons.
What's the difference between the priest and the sexton?
The priest was the American 105, and the sexton had the 25 pounder.
So the British variant, right?
British, yeah, yes, but with 25 pounder. Yeah. Still, really hadn't lost their cavalry identity. They spent some time in East Anglia, in Berkshire, on the West End Ranges and Salisbury Plain training. Then they moved up to Thirsk. This is when they were really tested in terms of their artillery. And it didn't all go well. During one of the shoots, the Remy corporal was still working on the target. as the battery fired on it. And this was being witnessed by a senior officer. So that battery sergeant major was removed quickly, and I think was never seen again. So they lived on Thirsk Racecourse, and then again things changed. So at the end of 42, the 3rd Regiment of Essex that bore the name Essex Yeomanry was raised. This demand for more and more artillery, and this was 191st Field Regiment Royal Artillery, Herts and Essex. So not only has the 1st Regiment been split to form 147, 147th is now split to form 191st, which we can maybe talk about later. So everything is keying up towards 43, 44, towards D-Day. And one of the most memorable parts is when they test this concept of firing on the run-in on D-Day. And they do this in Scotland. So the guns are in landing craft. It's not really been done before. And they're given a Scottish island to fire on. And they set off from Rothsay, the Isle of Bute, at 4 o'clock in the morning. But ahead of them has gone one of the FOOs, forward operating officers, with a small launch and some Royal Marines to place the target marker before the fleet hits it. The island, I think, was privately owned. It's called Inchmarnock. And he applied a signal lamp to act as the regiment's target. And his orders were very simple from the CO. You will be off the island by 6 o'clock in the morning. And he says, what happens if I'm not? He said, you will be off the island by 6 o'clock in the morning. And by the way, take your shotgun because we may go duck shooting afterwards. So they sail up towards through Rothsay Harbour to this gale and rain towards this little island, and eventually find it, and it's dark. And the 3 Essex Yeomen, the officer and his 2 signallers, climb this hill and plant the signalling lamp. And it's 5:30 when they get down to the beach, and they can't find their boat with the Royal Marine. He's gone. And eventually they find him, and the Royal Marine is so sick, he's unconscious in the boat. He's got such awful seasickness. And just as they're leaving this tiny island, the landing craft appear, and the salvos, he describes them as a flock of geese passing overhead, pass over and amazingly hit the target lamp. First time it's been done. And so they all congratulate themselves that night that actually firing artillery from landing craft seems pretty easy, really. What have we got to worry about on D-Day? So that is sort of late 43, a bit more training in 44. They have one more attempt at this, and it's described as a stock car race at sea, that it is utter chaos at night with landing craft moving randomly around, bumping into each other. They had a start line marked by a destroyer, absolute chaos. It was 4 months to D-Day. So they were nowhere near ready at that point. They've done it once, but it was not slick at this point.
How is that landing on D-Day? Because I've always assumed, without any evidence, that these guns firing from the landing craft going in couldn't possibly be particularly accurate, and they must be just more to keep people's heads down because your boat's bobbing about, there's confusion everywhere. How far from the truth was that for their D-Day?
That's pretty true. As with all armoured troops, they spend their build-up time waterproofing their vehicles. They've added extra stowage racks. Everything is covered with this thing called Compound 219, a mixture of grease and fibre that became a putty, and then a layer of Bostik. Engine intakes were pushed up in the air. And then they're locked down in their camp just outside the New Forest in the south of England. They set off. The weather, as everyone knows, the first day of D-Day was awful, so they didn't set off till the next day. They're held at the Isle of Wight, bobbing around on these enormous buoys. And it starts going wrong when they approach. So one of the landing craft, first of all, has an engine problem that night and drifts away. So it plays no role in the run-in shoot. And there are 4 vehicles in each landing craft. They fire over the vehicles in front. And these are 25-pounders. There is extra ammunition in the landing craft for that shoot. And then underneath is a separate sledge carrying 25-pounder ammunition that will be dragged through the water onto the beach. The idea being the pallets are broken up on the beach to replace the ammunition that's been used in the run-in shoot. So night described as black as sin at the Isle of Wight before they set off. And there's one lovely description, and I remember these as a battle naive, a battle green unit. They've been in the UK from 1939 to 1944. And one of them is sharing a landing craft with a captain from the Northumberland Hussars, another TA Yeomanry regiment, anti-tank regiment, who'd been in the desert. And he announced he wanted a bath. The Essex Yeomanry, Captain Max Beale, who's a very well-known Essex Yeomanry officer, I thought you were being a bit optimistic is the only thing is a little hand basin on this LCT. Why do you need a bath? As he started stripping off in a bowl of water, he said, well, it's very important if you're in the desert that if you're wounded and you're dirty, your wounds will be really far more serious than if you're. So Beale says, oh, this sounds very sensible, really. So he strips off as well and starts washing as his boys are stripping the cam nets off their vehicles and breaking open the pallets. His officer is having a quick wash in a bucket of water because he's been told it's a good thing to do. So they approach Gold Beach and they're supporting 231 and 69 Brigade. They lose comms with their launch. So their launch that is meant to be directing the artillery fire, again, has got lost at night. So that has got their own officers on it, and they've gone. So they don't know what they're firing at to start with because they can't talk to anybody. So they eventually signal via oldest lamp to the adjacent, I think it was 90 City of London regiment, and they get the coordinates of where to fire on. But even that is inaccurate. There's a lot of discussion about whether the coordinates were changed during the run-in, and many people feel it couldn't have been changed. Others feel that there may have been orders sent to change coordinates. But you're absolutely right. They basically don't do much. They hit the beach and the surrounding area, but not a lot happens.
What wave are they going in? I mean, I know it doesn't really happen in waves.
They're supporting Hampshire's.
What time are they going in?
Well, timings. So they're supporting the infantry. So they're really just behind the infantry and behind the funny. So it's early o'clock.
That's right. No, I was just slightly intrigued because it's the timings almost makes more sense than the waves, because I know the whole idea of waves sort of breaks down where you suddenly, when they're going at 6:30, someone's going in 5 minutes later, you're going, oh, that's very close to the front as they go in. Did they manage to roll off the landing craft without any problems and up the beach? Yeah,
so they're due to fire from 6:50 until 7:25, and they're being supported by two cruisers nearby.
This is as they're coming in, they're firing, isn't it? They're not sitting off the beach.
Firing from the landing craft with cruisers firing above them. So there are mixed results. They fire 3,000 shells. There's a hell of a lot of ammunition. And their fire corrections are being called in from inshore, but it's still not close enough to the target for those fire corrections to be useful. So they don't do a great deal of damage. But the guns, have worked hard. The barrels, they describe as the barrels came too hot to touch. The heat caused liquid grease to run from the breech blocks. And at one of the officers' descriptions, when I was down in the well deck amongst the guns, checking and dealing with any hitches, it was a busy and noisy place. The guns fired every 15 seconds, dropping the range by 200 yards each minute. The gunners were slaving and sweating at their work, and the clang and the rattle of the gun drill and the all-enveloping noise prevented any real feeling of fear. So they approached the beaches, and it wasn't just the guns, the sextons in these landing craft. There were all the supporting vehicles. So there were the Bren carriers, the universal carriers, which were the signals vehicles. There were the M3 half tracks for the Battery 2IC. There was the Doctor's half track, and many of these ran into trouble when they came off the landing craft. So many of them sank because they were just out of their depth. Everyone knows what happened was many of the shells from the battleships that caused huge craters in the beach. Vehicles would just disappear into these. So some of the vehicle crews, the Doctor's wagon being one of them, sank, and they had to, when the tide went out, go and find what they could from it. So they went ashore to support the Hampshires and the Devons. And if we go forward a bit now, the forward operating officers are obviously right up there with the battalions. One of the most famous moments was the attack on the pillbox on the beach. So the Sherwood Rangers have already lost, I think, 3 or 4 Shermans, which have been taken out, and it's talked about an 88. It wasn't an 88 in this pillbox. The Foo, Captain Arthur Warburton, who was attached to the Sherwood Rangers, he stayed with them throughout the war. came back to see his own men, his Essex Yeomen, and said, you've got to do something about this pillbox. And so one of the sexton's sergeants looked at this and thought, what I'll do is I'll charge it and put my barrel through the embrasure and fire, which is exactly what he did. It's Sergeant Bob Palmer, who won a military medal for it. And he told his crew, this is what we're going to do. We're going to charge full belt at this pillbox. I'm going to put the barrel through the hole and press the button and see what happens. As they're approaching, and bearing in mind 4 Shermans have already been knocked out, which are, of course, better armoured because the sexton has an open cabin. So he approaches this, and his first round doesn't hit. And so he eventually gets the barrel inside and presses it. And there's a very interesting description from the driver who said the noise was very different from the normal shell firing. It was a very different sound. And it does, I'm not going to say destroys, it puts out of action the pillbox. Because later that morning, the Churchill with the sabot in it puts a round into it and actually destroys the pillbox itself. But the Essex Yeomanry certainly put it out of action before, so it could no longer be a threat to armour on the beach. So that was Sergeant Bob Palmer, and he lived to a ripe old age. I've interviewed his sister many times about him. He was very, very active in the Essex Yeomanry Association throughout his days, really. So they then, another battery is taken off to support 47 Commander at Port-en-Bessin, and then they push south towards Tilly, Saint-Pierre, and Cristo, and at point 103. And they're supporting, the 24th Lancers are there with them and the Dorsets. And they have they're facing Panzer-Lehr in front of them. And they have a really hard time there. They're firing pretty much over open sights. There's a very unusual situation where the infantry are so hard pressed that they ask the artillery for extra bodies to man the trenches on the forward face of point 103. And a few soldiers are sent off. They're given, they've got 1 Bren gun, a couple of rifles, and I think they're given a Piat, which they'd never seen before. They wouldn't have seen a Piat before because they're artillery. And the last comment from the infantryman as he disappears was that the best approach with a Piat is just wait for them to roll over you and then fire from behind. They thankfully don't use their Piat, and they're sort of left there really with the armour in these wheat fields in front of them. And everyone else moves out, and eventually the battery sergeant major comes to look for them and finds that they are the last men left at point 103. Everyone else is gone. So from there, they move through Holland.
Well, I was going to say, it's quite remarkable is for a unit that had spent all that time training, when they get to France, they are in continuous action. It's like box ticking of the operations that they take part in. It must be almost every major operation. Yeah.
I mean, so much has been written about the Sherwood Rangers in recent years. If you follow their journey through, they were supported by the Essex Yeomanry, by 147 throughout. We know what the Sherwood Rangers did, everything they did, the Essex Yeomanry that were there supporting them. So they moved through Belgium to Eindhoven and up towards Arnhem. And the batteries then are sort of split up. They do move into the island facing Arnhem. When the evacuation of Arnhem is taking place, they are contributing to some of the artillery support for that. And I remember interviewing one family member, he said he had a relative who was in the Essex Yeomanry shelling the sort of Oosterbeek, Arnhem area, and his other relative was trying to get out of there as a paratrooper. There's 511 battery at this point, which is inside the triangle, south of Arnhem, around the village of Zeeton, protecting the western flank of the Neda River, because there was still a threat at that point. One of the other batteries was just north of Nijmegen, and then the third battery was east of Nijmegen, supporting the US Airborne, the glider fields of Groesbeek. So they were busy. They supported that a lot. Then thereafter moved through Holland into Germany and garrisoned Germany until 46 when they were sent home.
So they are in the major operations all the way to the end. They end up in as a garrison duty.
They end up in garrison on the coast and are busy there. I mean, it was absolute chaos with refugees everywhere, huge numbers. Also, we underestimate the number of prisoners of war who are now wandering around, who actually outnumber the number of British soldiers there sometimes. So they carry out their garrison duty and then one by one are sent home. And it's interesting looking at what they did there, because, as you say, they've been incredibly busy from June onwards without a break at all. The odd bit of leave in Brussels, but not much. So they had to be kept busy. A lot of sports, a lot of sailing in Kiel Harbour. They accessed a lot of the yachts that belonged to Kriegsmarine and the Wehrmacht, and a lot of the soldiers learnt to sail as a sort of pastime to keep them busy. Then a famous inspection by Dempsey. After that, really, they lost their armour and one by one were sent home.
But at the same time, we have those lot in the Middle East end up in Austria, whereas their compatriots and sextants, do those lot from the Middle East remain, is that 104, remain as...
Yeah, so 104 fight up through Italy, keeping their 25-pounders. All that training in Syria they had was really towards the invasion of Italy. We all know how awful the weather was, etc. They move up towards the Austrian border gradually. So they're following really the Adriatic coast, skirting around Venice up towards Treviso, around Lake Comacchio. They're busy as their fellows were in Normandy. Their sort of biggest involvement, the biggest battles was the crossing of the Senio. It's an unusual river because it was massively banked on both sides to protect the surrounding plain from floods from the mountain water at the end of the winter. It had defences really on four sides: the front, back of the south facing, and the front, back of the north facing, with bunkers in between. And there was one of the sort of most almighty heavy strategic bomber drops on the river. Then the artillery hit it, and then Churchill Crocodiles and Wasps from 21st Tank Brigade and 51 RTR engulfed the riverbank in flame, and then the infantry went in. And it was pretty quick after that. Remember, there were foos with the infantry battalions who were there, the Frontier Force Rifles, the 1st Argyle, so they were moving forwards with the infantry when they did cross. I think there were a couple of Gurkha VCs during that action. And then the guns moved up. They were supporting at one point the 17th, 21st Lance and the 16th, 5th. And what somebody describes it as real Royal Horse Artillery stuff. We were advancing, preceded by a series of divisional stonks. As our leading tanks moved into the target area, my job was to lift the fire onto the next target. At one point, they were firing almost over open sights, accompanying armour. A very rapid move. And then the pace of the battle moved quickly then, and they moved up into Himmelberg in Austria, where they garrisoned that until they were gradually sent home. Do you want to say a little bit about, shall I talk a little bit about 191?
Well, this is intriguing as well, Herts and Essex. So this is kind of Hertfordshire, presumably, well, Hertfordshire borders Essex. Why is there a Herts and Essex regiment and not just a Herts or just another Essex?
There wasn't a Hertfordshire Yeomanry regiment, which was another Sexton regiment, which was on the beach at D-Day as well. But there was thought to be a need for even more artillery. So the Hertfordshire Yeomanry and 147 Essex Yeomanry were stripped out to form the nucleus for this new regiment, 191st Field Regiment Royal Artillery. Again, that had 3 batteries. They had separate identities. Some of them kept their Hertfordshire Yeomanry identity. Some kept their Essex Yeomanry identity. Some were a real mix. Again, similar type of officers and men as before. They spent some time in Yorkshire. What was interesting about their training is that everything was very tight with them. They were a new regiment. They were 25-pounder regiments. So they didn't spend the time on traditional army bull. So it was not important to their officers and sergeants to spend time polishing things. They were far more focused on gunnery. And, I think very, very sensible. They were very proud of their identity. They produced this new flash, which had the 3 sea axes of Essex and the hart, the deer of Hertfordshire. They landed sort of between La Rivière and Cossé-sur-Mer a few days after the 6th of June. And again, were involved in the advance through Normandy. And they had a very unusual CO called Hope, Lieutenant Colonel Hope. He was a regular soldier and he was an absolute fanatic. He was given the offer of making 191 a regular regiment, which was a big honour for a TA regiment to be given regular status. And he discussed it with his officers, and they all felt this would be the wrong thing to do, that it would remove their county identity and make them just another generic Royal Artillery regiment. So they chose to remain as a TA regiment, and that would have affected his promotion prospects as well. But he was an absolute fanatic. And what was interesting about him was that if his artillery tasking had finished, he wouldn't sit quietly waiting for the next one to come from him, from Commander of Artillery. He would actively go look for things to do outside the command structure. So there was one famous episode in Normandy where artillery just appeared to shell a target from a regiment that should have been nowhere near there, which was his regiment. At one point, he was supporting both commandos and parachute brigade and was given, I think, a green beret to wear. He wore the Denison smock. He was actually, and I think this is true, so I've looked into this in depth, the first man into Caen. He should have been nowhere near Caen. He was an artillery regiment commanding officer, but he dragged out his driver and his 2IC and drove into Caen and found the local population sheltering within the abbey who thought they'd been relieved, but they were nowhere near being relieved at all. And then he left his 2IC there and said, look, I'll go and find some troops now to relieve them all, and appeared with a troop of Shermans. And there was still a lot of fighting going on at that point. And then the infantry and the armour moved into Caen. But that wasn't enough for him. At that point, I think he found some French resistance. And I think it was either a Panzerfaust or a Piat. He went out on his own looking for tanks. Military madness. He should have been with his commanding his regiment, but he was out tank hunting as a commanding officer of an artillery regiment. So we go in sort of later in 44. The need now is for infantry, they've supported the Canadians, they've supported Parachute Regiment, they've supported Parachute Brigade, they've supported the Royal Marines. The need is for infantry, and they are disbanded after dealing with 6th Airborne. So he decides to fire every piece of ammunition he's got, including smoke. He's not going to hand back any ammunition at all. And they put this almighty barrage, including high explosive, including smoke, and I think it's at across the Maas, yes, the River Maas. And that was their final goodbye. And I think the last word about 191 was from one of their subalterns, Lieutenant Stuart White, who went off to 33 Field Regiment afterwards. And he said 33 had been somewhat more restful than 191. When 3 Div wasn't doing anything, we didn't either. Maurice Hope couldn't go looking for other battles to join.
Trying to win the war on his own. It's amazing, isn't it? How, they fought all the way through in 3 different theatres, one sort of county regiment. But when it came to that post-war world, did the regiment remain? Did it become Royal Horse Artillery? Did it become Royal Artillery? How does that drawdown work from the sort of late 40s into the 50s? Where does it settle?
I forgot to say this. One of the most famous Essex yeomen was the late Richard Holmes.
Military historian, yeah. War Walks, who got me started on the TV.
Yeah, I mean, I met him as a young captain when he was our brigade commander. And he, before he'd done anything, he was in the Queen's Regiment originally, had been a gunner in the Essex Yeomanry, and in the 50s when they still had 25-pounders. So they kept their artillery into the sort of 50s, 60s, and then a lot of the names, the officers and the soldiers who'd been there during the war stayed on. And then they lost the artillery and became a signals regiment, and their current existence is as troop/squadron level signals, but not as a full regiment anymore.
I was slightly intrigued by how does the yeomanry memorialise the Second World War? Is there an action or that they hold up as their defining moment of the Second World War? Obviously, you've got 3 different theatres to think about.
Yeah. Well, there are no veterans left now. When I started this work, and the Regimental Association very kindly embraced me, Colonel Stephen Folkes, who's was the honorary colonel, knew a lot of these men. When he was a young officer, they were all alive. And he tells fantastic stories that there was real rivalry between those who'd been in the desert and those who'd been in Normandy. Those who'd been in the desert said, well, look, you didn't do anything between 39 and 44. You were just at home. Those who'd been in Normandy said, well, you didn't really have proper fighting like we had in Northern Europe. And half your time was spent playing tennis in Alexandria. So there was rivalry. I think D-Day is seen as that it was such an unusual use of artillery firing from landing craft is probably seen as their sort of major battle honour. But the two First War battle honours of Fraserburg Ridge and Monchy-le-Preux are as important, really.
Because you've also got, I think, taking part in Alamein. They're kind of there. They're literally box ticking the big events of the war.
Yeah, they are. And I sort of glossed over, Walcheren and supporting the Canadian 9th Infantry Brigade, Le Camp Piquet, then supporting, get the right parachute brigade here, 6th Airborne Division on the River Orne. I don't think there was anybody really they didn't support that didn't carry the name Essex.
Yeah, they really did serve everywhere well. Thank you, Stephen. Loyal listener, if you'd like to learn more about the Essex Yeomanry, Stephen's book is Shield and Protect, an illustrated history of the Essex Yeomanry. It covers the regiment's entire history from its inception through both World Wars. Next time, I'll be joined once again by Prit Putard to discuss Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive that was launched in the summer of 1944. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.